Good afternoon, and thank you everyone for joining our fourth annual symposium of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events. It's really good to have you here. We had maybe hoped to be more in person, but actually we found that for our annual symposium, it's actually good to have it online because we can attract people from all over the world. And I can see that people are joining online all the time at the moment on this platform called AirMeet that we're using. And we've got people here from, I'm looking at Cape Town in South Africa and Paris, the UK more widely. So it's really great to have a wider audience on this important topic of localism, re-evaluating the future of culture, events and tourism. Never more timely, given that we're just coming out of the pandemic and these industries that have been really severely hit over the past couple of years are looking at how they can use the concept of localism in terms of regeneration, international development and visitor attraction. Just to say that if you would like to ask a question, then please post it in the question and answer session if you want, or raise your hand, and at the end of Lord Thurso speaking, we can actually invite you on stage with him. If I can work out the technology, we can invite you on stage with him to ask your question in person, but by all means, please just post it in the chat. I'd like to thank UWS and Renfrewshire Council, our partners, for continuing to fund the centre and for the conference today, and look forward to hearing more from both of those later on in our sessions. So without further ado, then I'm going to hand you over to our keynote speaker, and I'd like to welcome Lord Thurso, who's the third Viscount Thurso. He's the chair of Visit Scotland and ex-officio board member of Visit Britain. John will present his keynote entitled Scotland's Themed Years, How These Engage Scotland's Creatives while simultaneously growing our culture, events and tourism offering. John, thank you very much for your time today, and I really look forward to hearing you speak.
Gail, thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon everybody, and welcome to everybody who's coming from all around the world. When I was thinking about this talk, I wondered how I might approach it, because it's a pretty large title. Scotland's Themes Years and How These Engage Scotland's Creatives while simultaneously growing our culture, events and tourism offering. So I thought what I would do is just sort of unpack that a little bit. I mean, obviously talk about themed years, and I'll come to that. But, you know, what are our creatives? I think we're all a bit creative. There's much more creativity around than perhaps we realise. But those who are actually in the creative industries and how they relate to tourism and everything we're doing. There's also the question of the value and purpose of tourism, which I'd like to talk a little bit about. And of course, something that's very dear to my heart, which is the proposition of responsible tourism, which is tourism and how it interacts in the modern world as we try to become more sustainable, not simply in terms of carbon, but also in terms of the impact on our communities. So I'd like to begin, first of all, by saying a big thank you to CCSE for having me here. And what a great initiative, and well done to the University of West of Scotland and Renfrewshire Council for having created that. And I hope the initiative goes from strength to strength. So at the end, when I come to a conclusion, I'm going to leave time for questions, and I do hope I will prompt you to think about some questions, and do, as Gail said, put them either in chat or raise your hand towards the end, and I hope we'll have cover all of those. So as a start point, I'd like to just say that in my view, tourism is a force for good, and I hope that when I finished, I will have made the case for the fact that tourism is a force for good. There's the obvious economic benefits, and these are the ones which people all refer to, and I will discuss those. But possibly more importantly, something that's come out of the pandemic and lockdowns is the contribution that tourism can make to a well-being economy, to the well-being of society, and to act as a force for good in connecting us back all together. So let me then turn, first of all, to say a little bit about me and my experiences, because they are what has formed many of the opinions that I hold today. And looking at the diary, I realized that it's almost 51 years to the day since I sat in the boardroom of the Savoy Group, as it then was, the Savoy Hotel in London, and had a fearsome interview and was taken on to be a trainee manager with the. I took a year off before I actually started to go around the world. And one of the things I enjoyed doing was spending 6 months as a cowboy in Arkansas, where I learnt to rope and bulldog. Neither of those things I would wish to try and repeat now as I approached my 70th year. But my training was a classic old fashioned training where they kind of dropped you in the deep end. And if you were still swimming around 4 years later, they gave you a job. But it was a wonderful training in many ways. I started at the kitchens of what was then the New Berkeley for a year. I then worked in the meat buying department at Old Smithfield, in the fruit and veg buying department, which was still at Covent Garden. Hadn't yet moved to Nine Elms, and then as a waiter at Claridge's, and then in the offices, and finally back to Claridge's to work in reception. And I was extraordinarily lucky because I was promoted rather quickly to be a reception manager. And then not long after that, the chairman of the company sent me to Paris to run the Lancaster Hotel in Paris, which was not part of the kind of closely supervised group of hotels in London. And I was very much on my own. And for me, that began a journey of studying people, trying to understand people, and coming to a conclusion that I came to that people are the central, most important part of virtually everything we do. And, there's lots of phrases one can coin that good people make good profits and all sorts of other things. But actually, I realized then, and I was only 27, I realized then that if I wanted to get anything done, I needed to be able to um, get my team to come with me. And that was about giving them a very clear vision. It was about communicating with them. And it was giving them a committed leadership. And that all started really from that experience in Paris. And then from there, I was hired to a place called Cliveden, which is a stately home just outside of London. And the people who hired me were turning it into a hotel. And I was there for about a year before we actually opened it. And it became Britain's highest rated hotel in several of the guides and with Michelin stars and so on. But the fascinating thing for me in creating that was that actually, firstly, the opportunity to build the team from day one and hire absolutely everybody who was in the team. But the second thing was that it, it, it wasn't just about coming to spend a night in a bedroom. It was about an experience. So we wrote. The first job I had was to write what in the opera world you'd call the libretto, the book. And I actually we put together a language. We never talked about the hotel. It was always the house. We never talked about waiters. It was footmen. We never talked about maids. We talked about housemaids, and this was all to build the experience. At that time, there was a very popular television program called Upstairs Downstairs, and we used to say we're giving them the upstairs downstairs experience. To those of you who don't remember that, the equivalent today would be Downton. We were giving them the Downton experience. So from the moment they arrived, we treated them as something much more special than simply a punter who was spending the night. And once we got that psychological approach right, it went from strength to strength. And that was the first time I started to think really about the travel offering as being more than simply a hard transaction of buy a bed, but something that had a lot more in it. And the fact that you could charge more money and deliver more value if you'd thought that through in terms of an experience. And from there, I thought, well, that's a great hotel. I'll never run a hotel that good again. So I went off and took on a job running a company in East Sussex, which owned a golf club. But while I was there, I visited Sissinghurst, which was a National Trust property, and was talking to the people in charge. And they were saying that they were going to have to ban visitors from going on the lawns because the footfall of the visitors was wearing out the lawns, which was one of the things they'd come to see. And that was the first time I had a sort of light bulb moment when I thought, hang on a minute, doing great things, economic benefit of offering travel is great, but there is a downside, and it's the impact. And that started me thinking along the lines of, well, how do we deliver the best economic benefit whilst having the minimum environmental and social disruption? And then from there, I ended up, my last sort of proper job was at Champneys, which I took over, and I had to unpick a timeshare amongst other things. But what we did there was we created a new vision for the place, which is again built around the fact that people stayed for quite a long time and they needed to have an experience. And we developed Champneys Mind, Body, Soul, but we developed the concept of nowhere else makes you feel this good. So what we were saying to people was, whatever you do, nowhere else will make you feel this good. And the point was to develop that not only for the people coming to stay, but it's what we said to the people working for us and what we said to the people investing in us. So this was our vision for the property. So I started off on that journey. I have to say, at the end of that, I fell into, by accident, into politics and became a politician for 14 years. And I'm delighted to say I'm now a recovering politician, and I'm almost fully recovered, so you needn't worry too much. But at the beginning of that journey, I very much thought of myself as somebody who simply provided beds for people. I was a hotelier, and it was highly transactional. And then during the journey, I started to think of myself much more as a tourism provider, as somebody who was part of the tourism industry. And I was thinking about, how do I get to people to come to my place? Where I am today is, and it's largely based on some work done by the late Professor Victor Middleton, is I think of us as the visitor economy, because it's much wider than simply tourism. The visitor economy is the interlinking of the travel industry, the tourism industry, the food and drink industry, the events industry, the creative arts, and all of the supply chains that go into putting them together. And it's a much bigger and wider definition than simply tourism. So let me just reflect for a moment on the visitor economy. Now, anybody in my position giving a talk like this always starts with lots of very big figures, percentages of GDP and all the rest. For me, the most important figure, and I take 2019 as my reference year because of the obvious drop through the pandemic, but in 2019, 219,000 people were employed directly in tourism, in the visitor economy. The contribution in gross value added terms to the Scottish economy was about just over 5%. And that hides as an average the fact that in many parts of the country it's much higher. And that shows the way in which, if you like, the wealth that is created by tourism is dispersed. I remember once hosting a panel for the Tourism Society, and there was a tourism minister sitting on the panel from an island in the Pacific, and he said something that stuck with me ever since, which was that tourism and travel is the largest voluntary transfer of wealth from the developed countries to the developing countries. And it was the word voluntary that struck me. And the same is true, and I'll come on to it a little later, in regards to the remoter areas of Scotland, where the visitor economy is closer to 20% of the local economy. And the wealth that is transferred from the more industrialized, say, Central Belt, voluntarily by people going to visit and enjoy the experiences of those areas, is a really important factor, I think, that needs to be taken into account. And I see it as one of the reasons, one of the great drivers of tourism. So for me, the obvious economic benefits of tourism can be summed up in a phrase that I coined many years ago, which is that tourism is an economic endeavor which, like any other, seeks to get the maximum economic benefit for the minimum environmental and social disruption. I also used to say that tourism is what a country does for economic benefit, leisure is what a civilized society provides to its population for their benefit. But I actually think that those two are now overlapped. And one of the lessons of the pandemic is that the provision of leisure and the pure commercial provision of tourism have become far more intertwined than I think we ever thought of in the past. And the other thing that's come out through the pandemic is we've got a much greater sense of place. And that has brought into sharp focus the needs of people locally and the interrelationship between those who are traveling to somewhere and those who live somewhere. And I think that's an important part of what this conference this symposium will be discussing. But I think the single biggest change that I've seen across my time is the move from pure travel to get to somewhere to the traveling in order to do something, in order to have an experience. And all of our data at Visit Scotland now tells us that people are traveling not to simply tick off the bucket list of I've been to these 10 places, but rather to actually enjoy an experience when they get there. And of course, to enjoy an experience, you have to create it. And the opportunities to create experience are huge. I was reminded of a cartoon by the famous cartoonist Mac. It's about 30 years ago, and it's an American, a caricature American, obviously, with a large cigar, dollar bills coming out of his shirt pocket, and strung with Leica cameras all the way around, turning to his wife as he gets off the bus, saying, "If it's Tuesday, it must be Frankfurt." And those were the days when it was a European capital a day, and you ticked them all off, and that was it. Um, that all really came about because in the 70s, the first 747 jets, somebody called Freddie Laker invented. He was really the godfather of low-cost air travel. All of these things came about, and tourism and travel went from being something that really only pretty wealthy people could do to something that was available to many more people. Today, we are changing, and all of our research shows us that particularly the post millennials and the late millennials, Generation Z, are into is enjoying an experience. And the wonderful thing that enables that is really social media. So nowadays, you go to a restaurant, the first thing you do when the lovely plate of food arrives, you take a photograph of it and send it to everybody. I mean, my generation would never think of that. And every day on Instagram at Visit Scotland, we are putting out a picture. My wife's a great follower of it, and she says it's mostly about either food or Highland cows. And she says Highland cows get over 50%. Well, why not? We all know it. We all love them. It's great. So if you look at that, and if you look at the experiences as being the real driver, then we need to create them. Whether it's a visit to the farm and you spend 3 days on a farm and you learn to shear a sheep or care for calves or whatever it might be, whether it's the part of the Unboxed Festival and the dandelion projects that are going around all over Scotland at the moment, I think are absolutely wonderful, whether it's a cultural event from the mod and the Feis movement and all of the other things, or whether it's Highland Games or whatever it might be, or whether it's sporting events, or whether it's just, as we come on to the theme years, about using a theme to create something within that theme. All of these things create experiences which enhance the tourism product. So let me just touch on responsible tourism very briefly. It's very dear to my heart. Began about 5 years ago when we had a Borderway Day, and I think I raised the question, we are in the travel industry, we're in tourism, we love what we do, we're very proud of Scotland and everything we've got, but travel and accommodation are two of the biggest consumers of carbon. What are we going to do about it? So I did a little paper. The team at Visit Scotland grabbed it with both hands. Absolutely fantastic. And out of that work, 2 years later, came what is now responsible tourism. And briefly, it has two strands. Strand one is about sustainability. It's about lowering carbon use throughout the industry, about doing it actually where we can, and about being a thought leader for the industry on that. And the second part is about sustainability of communities and how we help communities to get the tourism they want, and not have the tourism that they don't want. And if I look at the sustainability side, I mean, I think there's going to be some fantastic technological changes. I'm engaged in a little project at home, which is creating a 5-bedroom luxury B&B. And when I finished it, it should be completely off grid. We will have our energy from wind and solar, and the heating will come from a huge store of hot water that has been heated by solar panels, all sorts of other things. And it's a tremendous opportunity that we have in the far north. We've got those natural resources, we can do that. But also, I've been following with fascination the electric aeroplane that's been trialled between Caithness and Kirkwall. And there's this rather interesting and exciting possibility that within the not too distant future, the most environmentally friendly way to visit the Orkney Islands will be in a small electric aeroplane, which slightly stands received with wisdom on its head. But also, our attitudes have to change. And I think I see it already. People are prepared to pay more for a low carbon experience. And there's some wonderful work going on with Wilderness Scotland is one company that's doing it, where they're actually noting the amount of carbon in every product so you can make an informed choice. But ultimately, the third thing I think is we're all going to have to change our behavior. And for me, one of the great behavioral changes will be to go to slow tourism, which very rapidly I would define as being, instead of travel, stay, travel, stay, travel, stay, it would be travel, stay, enjoy, and stay, and enjoy, and stay. So we need to find ways to really work through responsible tourism and to profit from it. And on communities, I would just say that localism has many definitions, but it's about people in their area being in control of their own destinies. And so for tourism, it's really important that we are able to work with communities so that they get the economic benefit, but they don't get the disruption either environmentally or social. Now, we've done the easy bit, which is to talk to them. I think the great challenge going forward will be to turn that into more of a reality, simply because much of the structures necessary are actually asymmetric. So if you look at tax, for example, half of all the VAT raised in Scotland goes to the Scottish Treasury. That's a pretty immediate input. Get a rise in tourism, and lots more money goes into the central treasury. The problem is the expenditure required to provide the infrastructure to support that economic activity is delivered by local government, who don't actually get any benefit, which is the reason why the Scottish Government developed the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund, which we administer, which is about helping local governments to do parking places and loos and all the other things that are really needed. But I think there's more that we can do there. And I think the difficult part is very much going to be around helping local communities to be able to be in charge of their own destinies, given the structures that we actually have. So let me turn then to theme years, and I've got 3/4 of the way through this without hardly mentioning them, which is quite fun. But anyway, they've been around since 2009, and obviously the start point was how it was basically devised to help us market Scotland and to market what we had in Scotland. But right from day one, it was always decided that there should be a particular focus in every year, and it should be more than simply a question of marketing. So it has to be, and I think it is, a showcase for the very best of Scotland, its product, its places, and its people. So it's both inward looking as well as outward looking. It's a tremendous collaborative platform that's been provided over the years. And at the moment, with the Year of Stories, it's a tremendous platform for helping us to recover from the last 2 years. So what is behind the themed years is obviously something that will promote Scotland. And if you look at the beginning, the first ones, they tend to be things like, 2014, the year of homecoming, dead simple, get everybody to come over, great fun. 15, the year of food and drink, well, no brainer for Scotland, some of the best food and certainly the best drink in the world, with apologies to those who have come in from Paris. And then you've got 2016, you start to see a change. That was the year of innovation, architecture and design, a recognition of going perhaps wider than the standard, what you might think of as being the visitor economy, tourism. And then the first one I joined in 2016. So the first one I was introduced, was part of, was 2017, which was the year of history, heritage and archaeology. And that was a fabulous year for being able to get things to do and find new places to visit. Then we had 2018, the year of young people, which was about celebrating youth. And that gave us a wonderful opportunity to see what young people were doing right across society. From we got a youth board going for a bit in Visit Scotland, and had young people visiting our board meetings, and then you had young creatives getting involved in things. So it's a really splendid one. And then in at that point, we also decided to move from doing an every year themed year to moving to doing one every 2 years, because we realized you need a year of build up to be able to actually really get into the year. So the next one was 2020, which was the year of coasts and waters. And we rolled that on for an extra year to 2021 because of the pandemic. But what a fantastic theme to have as we were let out of lockdown in the summer of 2020. Everybody headed for the coast or water. It was absolutely fantastic. And now in 2022, we've come on to the year of stories, which I think is just tailor-made for virtually every part of Scotland and anything anybody wants to do, because you can create a story. There's the obvious of our television, film, our old literature, our new literature. All of these things obviously are there, but I think it's the National Trust and Historic Environment Scotland have both actually written themed tours about their properties. They've actually created stories for people to experience. So a really tremendous way. And in the heart of all of that is the story of people thinking creatively and being creative. So what I hope I've been able to demonstrate is that the way in which tourism has evolved, very much like my personal development, has been a story about seeing the wider impact of tourism, the ability to use tourism and the travel, the visitor economy, as this force for good to not only deliver an economic benefit, but also to get people to be far more creative and to explore themselves as well as their areas. Now, my conclusion, therefore, is pretty straightforward, and it is that without our creative industries, who are the professionals in this, to make us think and to help us think and to help us do all of these things, we'd be a much poorer place. So for me, the creative industries, the delivery of cultural events, the delivery of sporting events, just thinking about how you can be more creative in your business is absolutely the heart of the inspiration of the themed years and what we are looking to do. And I think it's been a journey of discovery for ourselves, but it's also a revelation for our visitors. So thank you again for asking me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, John. That was really insightful. I really liked the way that you started on with responsible tourism and how the culture developed and neatly took us into the themed years. I think this year's really interesting what you're saying about the stories and how everybody can relate to stories. So I can see there's some questions coming in, but I'll just start you off on that. I think I was thinking about what you were saying in relation to the responsible tourism and then asking people to stay home and enjoy it and spend time. And I wonder to what extent we're then going to take that to accessible tourism, with these, because one of the things that happened in the pandemic was everything closed, and whilst we could go to the outdoors or we could go to the countryside, we couldn't really access any facilities. Car parks were closed, toilets were closed, and that stopped a huge part of our population being able to access that. So I think along with that responsible tourism and lies that accessible tourism of how do we welcome people back. We've got these themes on the coast and storytelling, which is all great, but we really need to make that more accessible for everyone as well. So it's about sometimes convincing people, I think, or how do we do that going forward, of convincing people that you can stay and enjoy there. And I think I was interested in what you were saying about the Rural Tourism Infrastructure Fund. Can that be used more, and how do we get people to know that that's available for them to use that in tourism terms?
Well, just starting with the fund, that is applied for by local authorities, so it's available to local authorities, and obviously it's rural local authorities, and it was designed very much. It was pre-pandemic that it was started, and it was really to help. We were looking at the time at Skye and the fact that people were saying there are far too many people coming to see the fairy pools. When we actually went and looked at it, what it was that there was a need for parking and there was a need for public lavatories. And that really, if you did a little bit of work, you could alleviate the perceived problem. And actually, if you looked at the benefits that were coming from the economic spend, it was supporting quite a lot of people. And where I am in Thurso, I've got the NC 500, North Coast 500 route, which goes right past my front door. And people are a bit Marmite about the North Coast 500 in that some people love it and some people aren't quite so keen on it. But actually, the one of the fascinating things to me is I know of a rural filling station which was really important in the local community on the northwest coast, which is open because of the footfall of tourists. And had it not been for the tourist footfall, that filling station would have closed, and the people living in that area would have been obliged to drive 25 miles to actually get to fill their cars up. Equally, I know of at least one and suspect another village shop on the north coast that is open because of the footfall, but were struggling before that came along. So one of the unseen benefits of the tourist footfall and the tourist spend is facilities that are open for everybody all year round that might be threatened with closure. But at the same time, and it goes back to that formula I was talking about economic benefit versus environmental and social disruption. If all the NC 500 is loads of people in vehicles going around it as fast as they can, then actually that benefit is coming at too high a price. So the answer to that is to slow them down. So instead of traveling every day, if they travel to and then spend 2 or 3 nights in a place, they get to know it. They get to know the locals and they spend more in that location. So I think slow tourism is very much a part of that answer. But I'm currently this year master of the Worshipful Company of Innholders in the City of London, being a glutton for punishment and not having enough to do. And I took, as master, you're allowed to do an outing every year. Each master does an outing, and I took my outing to Inverness. I had thought of taking them to Caithness, but I thought that might be a bridge too far. So anyway, took them to Inverness. But one of the things we did was, on the first evening, I took them to a place called Bogbane Farm, where we had the most wonderful evening of entertainment, which was the fiddle, guitar, Gaelic singing, bit of dancing, wonderful food, great atmosphere. And then the next day we went round Culloden, we visited Johnston's of Elgin, and we came back and did a full-on Burns night. Every single one of those people said, I had no idea there was so much richness to the culture of Scotland. Thank you, John, for bringing us up here. So I think it's a very long-winded answer to your simple question.
Yeah, that's okay.
I think there's an awful lot in there that we can do to get people up and to get them to slow down and enjoy.
There's a couple of, there's a few questions on the feed here, so you can maybe see them, but I'll try and say them as well. So Sandro has said, fascinating point, slow tourism seems very important point for a sustainable approach and more meaningful engagement with the local community. How can we can encourage that when most of our lifestyles are based on a fast and furious short city breaks? I'm also going to read the next one because there's also another one on slow tourism before I get to the third one on behavioural change. So there's another comment from Nicola saying, slow tourism seems to be a common theme that needs some better implementation and understanding into how this can be introduced and marketed. I agree that one of the way through is experiences and developing ways to keep tourists for longer. I think traditionally sometimes call is, we talked about this in cities previously about increasing the dwell time of people staying on city breaks, example. And so Nicola says, our question is, how can we change behaviours given the concept of slow tourism is less known and understood in many destinations? And I would sort of add to that is it's also, for me, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not rural versus urban, but how do we promote both of those in slow tourism terms?
Yeah, I mean, one of the great things about post-pandemic, when we were all let out, was all the people who'd been locked down in the city shot out to the countryside, and all the people who'd been locked down in the countryside shot into the city. And it's, to a certain extent, it was the change of experience that was what people were after. But I mean, it's a very new concept, slow tourism, and it's like slow food and everything else. It's about firstly slowing down and thinking through what you're doing, but it's about trying to get people. I mean, for me, the start point was around thinking about carbon use. And if we can therefore get people to travel once to enjoy a lot of experiences in the same place, then this is an improvement on them traveling every day or every other day. So that was the start point. The second thing is, I think, where we at Visit Scotland, I mean, all of this is early days. And I would say immediately, if I actually had an answer to any of this, I'd be doing it now. And I think
maybe we need something, a working group on slow tourism.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, because I coined the phrase in an article about 18 months, 2 years ago. I'm sure somebody else has used it, but it was the first time I used it. And I've been dreading the question, what is it? I know what I mean, but I don't always explain it terribly well. But it's about using less resource to enjoy more experience. That's really that's what the aim is. And I think that we can do a lot at Visit Scotland by actually helping people to change their offering. A lot of the offering that exists is based on the rush sort of philosophy. And I think that providers will begin to see that actually producing something that takes a little more time and is in more depth and costs no more energy will actually become something that, I mean, it goes back to some of the research we've done, which is that the younger generations will pay more. They'll pay more for a bedroom, which is why I'm doing my little experiment. They'll pay more for a bedroom, which they believe is genuinely carbon free or carbon neutral, than they will for the traditional, however many tons of carbon have gone into keeping the particular property going. So I think we know that that younger people who really care about the planet will actually pay more so that they can act on that. So there's method and profit in all of this. It's not a do good only. It is actually, there should be a win-win. So I hope that Visit Scotland will lead. In a way, just me talking about it has started a conversation. And it's now, interestingly, responsible tourism has gone from being a project at Visit Scotland to a core value of what we do. We've no longer got a project team. Yeah. Everybody is on that, and I think that's where you start. Somebody said, if you want to eat an elephant, start by cutting into very small chunks.
Yeah, and I think that we have seen a shift over lockdown and people being much more aware of the environment and young people and climate change. So, and on that, I think we have a couple of questions here. So I'm just going to read them sort of all, and then maybe you could answer them in a bundle. So it says, on the theme of Stephanie says, on the theme of behavioural change versus structural change, How do we balance the pressure for increasing visitor numbers and cultural attractions such as museums with environmentally sustainability and systematic strategies needed to fight the climate change? So again, a bit of a more urban issue there. Then Harman from DCMS has said it's people's choice to take a break or visit, even when not visiting a cultural asset, is not a GVA decision, but an individual's motivation improve their own health and well-being. So value may not look at non-market impact of tourism. So we can have a look at that. And then industry, Janice has said industry collaboration through tourism product building, packaging could aid in slow tourism. And there's quite a few. Katie Nico has said interesting point, trade on the NC 500, but it would seem that sometimes the local infrastructure cannot catch up with the vision of marketed route to drive slow tourism or fast. And then lastly, do you think there's a need for Visit Scotland to revisit the way it markets Scotland, move away from an international national approach and support a very localised approach? That's an interesting point right at the end there, because we talked about this thing. Oh, and then lastly, storytelling is the basis of slow tourism. So it could be through events that would communicate the need for behavioural change, is something that Visit Scotland is doing already. And absolutely, we talked before we came onto the call about the relationship between Scottish Government and Visit Scotland's external engagement strategy and the soft power agenda of selling Scotland internationally in touristic terms. And I think our themed years help to do that, because we can market on these stories or themes that helps local businesses, but then attracts tourism to a wider range of places locally, rather than just the main cities as we would often get. So maybe if you could take some of those points that have come through and see how you can tie that into the local and national agenda then. But that's quite a lot, so maybe just focus on one or two.
Yeah, I think that's another 25 minutes on those questions. But it just shows the extreme quality of the people who've joined us, because I think that
people are joining all the time, John, and we have had some people getting a few technological issues because it's the first time they've used AirMeet, so hopefully they'll bear with us. But we've got over 60 people in just now, so thank you.
I'd like to just talk about one of the questions there was about national and international. One of the things that I think at Visit Scotland, when we promote Scotland, we're not promoting tourism on its own. The whole point of the Scotland is Now campaign was actually to say that Scotland is a great place to come to study, to live, to work, to invest in, and to visit. And it therefore presents all of Scotland to people in a way that they might use it in any of those ways. So a great part of what we do is we are the only agency in Scotland that are actually actively promoting brand Scotland throughout the key markets in order to attract people to all of those things. And one of the most interesting things I've learned over the last few years is the relationship between people who come here to study in universities and colleges and their future relationship with Scotland. I think that's a really important thing. But the other thing is that if you go back to the economic endeavour, then overseas visitors are about 15% of the visitors to Scotland, but they produce about 35% of the spend. And so actually they are high spending, and high spending means they are in places which are often able to do higher value employment. And one of the great challenges I think the hospitality industry has is how to actually make the industry an industry that pays more to possibly fewer people, but to have a higher productivity rate. I think that's one of the great challenges that we have. I mean, broadly speaking, for every pound spent domestically by a Scot in Scotland, somebody from the rest of the UK will spend £2 and somebody from an overseas market will spend £3. And those kind of numbers are a great driver for what we're doing. And I think we can lead on all of these things in helping to shape product and supply on the supply side of the economy. And we can help to shape demand so that people will want to buy what we want to sell. And that is going to be based around our character, our natural environment. And to me, it's very much work in progress. And I am as much shopping for answers here as offering them, which is I'm certain that slowing things down, getting people to enjoy, but also spend quite a lot of money, is actually the way that we need to go. And I have not answered most of the questions there, but I'm very conscious of the time.